Welcome to sunny San Diego for Gravity this season. This series of videos will bring you principle-driven strategies and techniques for the sports of swimming, biking, and running, kind of a triathlon theme. So we hope that these videos bring you innovative ways to think about how you're training your clients, whether recreationally or competitively, for any of the following sports. This segment is for bicycling and it's called Thoracic Relief. Why thoracic relief? Well, I bet you've already figured it out by now. If you look at a cyclist, especially long distance cyclist, guess what position they're in during that whole race? Unless they're climbing or sprinting, they're in a thoracically flexed position. And just to kind of talk a little bit about the thoracic spine, it gets overlooked a lot. People with back pain and cervical pain, a lot of times they go to physical therapy or to a trainer, and guess what they work on? They work on the lumbar spine and the cervical spine, without even looking at the thoracic spine, which if it doesn't have a whole lot of mobility in all three planes of motion, might be causing all the motion to be up here or all the motion to be down here in any of the planes. So what we want to do is to make sure that that part of the spine as well has motion, so you get a nice segmental motion throughout your lifetime. If that gets gunked up, then you'll start to see a lot of problems either in the shoulders, even down to the foot and hip. If you really look at the chain reaction biomechanics, it gets real tricky. So our goal with this program is to keep our client, keep our bicyclist or a cyclist or a mountain biker or even our unicyclist healthy throughout the lifetime so that they can enjoy the sport. Real quick review of the principles of bicycling. As we know that it's a very whole body sport. It appears to be a sagittal plane sport, but from the other video you notice that there are many planes involved with this. Our principles are that you've got kind of a foot reaction rather than a ground reaction, and that you're operating in a very flexed position overall. So we'll bring the focus back up to the thoracic spine with our strategy of being able to open up the thoracic spine in extension, because part of the sport of bicycling is it's an endurance sport and you need oxygen. So if you're crouched down, you know that your lung capacity is shriveled up just a bit. So if we want to open that up so that throughout the day or even the sport, or maybe they sit up in their saddle, that you open up the lungs. We don't want people to get gunked down. You know that that's kind of accelerating aging. As you come down, you shorten in the pectoral muscles, you shorten in the abdominals, you shorten all around, and your world gets a little bit smaller and smaller and smaller. So to reduce those overuse problems, we're going to get into our techniques, which are going to be a lot of extension with rotation, and we'll use our shoulders and the GTS to facilitate those types of movements. So let's start off with our first exercise, and we need a cyclist. Is there a cyclist around? Yes, again, it's Nicole, the super athlete. So Nicole's going to demonstrate. We're going to go into part of what's called the post-rehab series, and that particular course teaches a lot about thoracic extension. We're going to tweak it a little bit and add a little bit of transverse plane and of course a little bit of frontal plane. So the first exercise is going to be just a kneeling version of the thoracic extension. We'll warm it up by eccentric loading. Now let me talk quickly about success. If a client is in flexion their whole time, then just telling them to sit up straight most of the time isn't going to work, because their body is telling you, I don't want to go there. This is where I'm good. So sometimes we have to drive them into flexion first to eccentrically load and proprioceptively turn on those muscles. If they get turned on and lengthened, then they can move in the other direction instead of just concentrically just cranking somebody back. I've even seen people put their knee in their thoracic spine and pull the shoulders back. That's passive. We want to be active here, so we're going to actively turn on the muscles. So what we're going to do is position her in flexion at the hip and in the spine, and what she's going to do is she can take her hands, just put them across her chest, and what we're going to do is drive first into flexion. So you're going to bring your head down and then come back up real slow, just a small range of motion. She leads with the cervical spine, and then we look at the thoracic spine movement. So just keep your gaze forward and just go back and forth in the sagittal plane. And you see here, this is a very good example of all the motion coming from the lumbar spine. So the lower thoracic, upper lumbar is where most of this mobility is occurring. So we have to have the mobility to have the stability. So as she keeps doing that, we'll sit here and watch, okay? There's a little bit of flexion here in the thoracic spine. A lot of times they'll start to come up at the hips, so we cue the client to keep the ribs on the thighs. So as long as the ribs stay on the thighs, they can come up into extension. But again, it's important perhaps to drive them into flexion first to turn on those muscles. How's that feel?
Okay.
Okay, it's a whole new movement for most people. Even when I started this thoracic extension business, it was tough stuff. Now what we're going to do is just tweak the plane. So we're going to bring the transverse plane in by driving one shoulder back. So she's going to start in flexion, rotate back with extension and right rotation, then just alternate sides back and forth. So a small movement and then all the way down. And she initiates this with the cervical spine. As soon as the cervical spine comes up, then she rotates around. So this is a small, subtle movement. It can easily be done. A lot of times you'll get to see right away where their movement's coming from. If you could really focus in and you had somebody with a sports shirt on or something that you can really see the facets of the spine, you'll really get an idea of what's moving and what's not moving. And whatever's not moving is probably what's causing the other things to take that hit, like the lumbar spine or the cervical spine. Okay, and then we can also add the frontal plane in by just driving through the frontal plane, so you kind of do like a lateral flexion type of move. And if we wanted to combine any of those, you may have heard of type 1 and type 2 movements. Type 1 being that you're going in two different planes but in the same direction. So if she's flexing, laterally flexing to the right as she goes through the, let's go to the other side, to the right, and then laterally flexing to the right. So I'm gonna make this real tough on everybody. We're gonna laterally flex right towards here, and then rotate up to the right. So you come down and then switch. So lateral flexion, extension, and rotation. So that's actually called tripling, meaning that we've got all three planes working at the same time, which gets more and more functional as we add those in. Okay, nicely done. Now what we're going to do now is just add a little bit of resistance. So the same thing, but with a little bit of resistance. So we bring the cables to Nicole, and she's going to do that same thing with the arms extended, and what she's going to do is drive the elbows. She's going to start with the cervical spine, come up into thoracic extension, and then drive the elbows back towards the ribs into kind of a seated row. So you can add a little bit of retraction there as well. And this feels goofy when you still do it, when you keep doing it. But you maintain the lower ribs on the thighs if possible. Pretty tough movement. But she gets a nice little flexion, turns on the muscles, and then moves up into extension. So you add resistance, you start to change the stimulus. Now maybe we drive one arm back, the right arm back, and let's add a little rotation in there. So she drives that shoulder up and then just alternates sides back and forth. Very good. So you can see how you can vary the planes and vary the resistance. Real easy exercise to keep the thoracic spine nice and healthy. Okay, let's go ahead and dismount the GTS. I'm going to lower your incline down just a hair. And we'll use, you've seen this before, and it's really just the driving through the frontal plane. So we look at that emphasis was obviously in the sagittal plane, and we tweaked in the frontal and the transverse. Now we're going to start with, let's go in a kneeling position facing me, high kneeling. And we're just going to do arm drivers to get the thoracic spine to move in the frontal plane. So the first thing we'll do is the same side driver where she's going to reach down here and grab and try to keep your hips right, just balanced over your knees. And we're just trying to extend this way. Let's try this way because it looks a little bit odd there. There we go. And if we could see her spine as she drives through and just go back and forth. We're going to load eccentrically and then come back up. Very nice. That eccentric and then the concentric. And if I can have my hands on her spine, you can see that a lot of the movement is coming down from that lumbar spine. So how can we tweak it? How can we make it? How can we find success? Well, cyclists are usually flexed, so give them that. Give them a little bit of thoracic flexion. It's going to look real goofy, and then try that same thing, and you might find a little bit more motion. So you got to start with that in, you tweak it in, and then as they start to get better at this, you tweak it out, so you bring them back into lateral flexion. Another way to do this is to use the opposite arm going overhead. So as she comes across, you'll see this motion here. It's the same lateral motion, but we're getting, a lot of the motion's coming down here, but she has a little bit more segmental motion here. And if we add in flexion, maybe you go into a hunched position, which cyclists will like that, and you come across, you can see that we're getting a little bit more segmental motion there. Very nice. Perfect. Now, what do? Once we got the motion, we got to add a little resistance. So maybe we, again, throw in this medicine ball. Yeah, we'll go left hand, opposite side overhead. How's that? So you add a little bit of resistance. You can also use, any type of tubing, or you can grab this pulley, throw the cable on, and put that in her hand and have her go through that same thing. Now remember, if you're gonna do that, that is a lot of load, so start on level 1 or 2. Feeling all right?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead and stand up.
Okay.
We're gonna go into what's called seated rowing, but again, initiating it with that scapular retraction and a little bit of thoracic spine flexion. So it looks a little bit like our thoracic extension, but now we're gonna focus on the scapular movement. So we attach the pulley. I've got the pulleys down nice and low, and we'll just go back to that kneeling position.
Okay.
Do you feel thoracically relieved already?
I
do. Do you? Okay, go ahead and grab these handles. And instead of going all the way into hip flexion this time, what we'll do is we'll work on just the seated row. So if I were to just say, let's just do some seated rows, let's just see what happens. We want to see, do the scapula go through protraction, really allow the back to kind of open up as you extend forward, and then retract back. So we get that nice scapular retraction that we're all familiar with. And if your client is in a hunched position, let's just act like you're a professional cyclist and you're very aerodynamic so that wind can go right over there and flow with no resistance, is maybe we start with that. We start with it and then drive through thoracic extension as you pull back.
Okay.
So it's kind of a big giant motion back and forth. So this is a good example of really giving them success, because you will see a lot of them, you'll see this big hump right here, right? And that's that thoracic kyphosis. So allowing them to have success in flexion, coming back to extension. And what would you do to change this exercise? What would you do? She would add a different plane in, very nice. So maybe going down to a little bit of flexion and then driving back and getting nice extension. So here with this one, you can see that we're getting a real nice rotational aspect of the thoracic spine, some nice extension. And then in the frontal plane, it's a little bit tricky here, but I might just say, all right, we're gonna stop the exercise, put a couple medicine balls in her hands and go back and forth. Very nicely done.
All right.
So the object is thoracic relief. The modality is the GTS, medicine balls, bands, whatever you can do, and to relieve that thoracic spine in any of the 3 planes of motion. If they're flexed, give them a little help by giving them where they're successful. Start them in flexion, head in that direction to eccentrically load, and then bring it back up. The stuff you may not have heard before, give it a shot, see if it works for your client. Everybody's put together a little differently, so you have to kind of do a trial and error thing to try to find the motion to give them the ability to have a healthy thoracic spine over the lifetime.